Hello, everyone. My name is Jane Power, and I'm a professor in the School of Sociology and Health Studies. I'm also a member of the Queen's Coalition Against Austerity. Thank you all for coming. I hope you meet those of you who are in person. Have grab some food. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. The North Shore of Lake Ontario and the area originally known as Tedrockweed sits on the land and waters of the Haudenosaunee of the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy and the Anishinaabe, specifically the Michi-Sagin and Algonquin peoples. This territory is also part of the Dishik-One-Spoon-Waha Belt Agreement, with directions to share the land and ensure there is enough for everyone. In the Queen's official land acknowledgement, they recognize that we settlers are uninvited guests on this land, which is a bit of a funny thing to think about, to be uninvited guests. Apparently, we're not going home, wherever home is. But I think when we're guests on someone else's territory, we should probably follow the protocols of that territory. You know, it's a bit like the phrase that I grew up with: when in Rome, do what the Romans do. And it's hard for me to imagine, I'm not an Indigenous person, but it's hard for me to imagine that Indigenous peoples would think of education as a business or as a factory. And so I think it's time we started following the protocols of the territory. And maybe we should ask them how they would like to think about education at this university. So we're here today. Thank you all for coming, because we're objecting to what is happening at Queen's, and we really care about this institution. And today's event is kickoff for a whole week of anti-austerity measures, which you can see up there. So today's the teach-in. Tomorrow there's a film screening and an anti-austerity social. On Friday, there is the FAS faculty board, and then there's an action that's aimed at the Board of Trustees on Friday evening. So there's a ton of resources available at the back. There is a brand new senior administration effectiveness survey. Many of you would have received. Many of you will have been already surveyed yourselves about effectiveness at the university. Now you can rate the senior administration. So please participate in that survey. There are posters about the anti-austerity social, and poster making is on Thursday, but there's a poster with the events. There is a whole resource list, news group and uniform resource list if you want to find out more about the multinational corporation that is engineering all the austerity measures at Queen's. There's also, oh yeah, okay, that's it. There's lots more. There's stickers too, solidarity, austerity. And before I hand it over to Rebecca, I just want to say a big shout out to the Queen's University Students versus Cuts. They're just incredible. Like, all I can say is wow, and I wish I had that energy still. And also big thanks to OCUFA, the Queen's University Faculty Association, for funding the lunch and other funds. And for all the work that everyone's doing to resist these austerity measures. I feel really proud to be part of the Queen's community. I've never actually, in 20 years, never seen action like this in solidarity with each other. And it's a horrible circumstance, but it's really heartening to see the solidarity. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca Hall, who is an assistant professor in global development studies and also the chair of the Political Action Committee at
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Well, I have the pleasure of introducing our three fabulous speakers today. We're going to begin with 3 talks. 2 of them are here in person, and then we're also welcoming Michael Savage on Zoom. And then we hope to leave ample time for discussion and questions and hopefully some strategizing. So David McDonald is going to start us off. He's a professor of global development studies here at Queen's, and he's also the director of the Municipal Services Project. He's conducted research in over 50 countries, including studies on benchmarking and the development of alternative indicators of good public service delivery. His most recent book is Meetings of Public and Future of Public Services. So thanks so much for joining us, David.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Now we sound too loud. Okay. All right. I wouldn't normally advise putting up this the first slide of your presentation, but I do it on purpose because if you'd asked me 20 years ago whenever you work on benchmark, look at it sideways, what the hell would I ever use that for? But I've come to realize how incredibly important it is for a whole range of reasons, not the least of which is what's happening in the public sector with benchmark. So I'm going to be very quick here today. Norma's going to talk a little bit more about performance indicators and so on, and then we'll talk about particular results in the agency. But benchmarking really, it's dead simple. It's just exactly what it sounds like. You basically identify things that you think are important, you try and measure them, and then you assess change, either within an organization, across organizations. We all do it at a personal level. We think about our fitness goals. We think about what we want to accomplish in life. You know, these are regular, standard kinds of things that we do. And one of the main points I want to make today is there's nothing inherently good or bad about benchmark, nor is there anything inherently neoliberal about benchmark. And we need to actually reclaim control of these things and talk about what is it that we want to measure. As I think Norma's going to talk about, there are tensions around quantitative measuring, and how does that relate to the qualitative questions around equity and so on, and how do we compare these things, and how do we use this kind of information? But it really is just another. She means that I'll just check through here. Nope, it's not. Again. Yeah. It really is just another tool. And we have to be able to decide what do we want to use this information for, how is it being used, who's using this information, who's analyzing this information, etc. And we'll see that it's clearly problematic in the way this particular consultancy firm is processing this information and the kind of information that they're gathering. So yes, it's not problematic, but there are a lot of real concerns that I've looked at. The history of benchmarking in a nutshell, Xerox, an American company, really basically got the ball rolling in the 1970s, worried about competition from Japan. And this modeling of benchmarking migrated very quickly to public sector. It is now ubiquitous. Hospitals, universities, public water operators, which is where my real interest came out of this, in terms of how we measure performance. Now, this has also been combined with 3 very important historical features. One was the emergence of new public management in the late 80s and 90s, which was essentially a move to start running public services like private corporations in the way that we remunerate managers, in the kinds of assessments that we make around particularly the financial bottom line. So there was a real transference of managerial models and a financial focus from the private sector into the public sector in the 1990s, coinciding, of course, with the rise of neoliberalism. Yeah. And our public services have been utterly transformed by the rise of new public management. I do a lot of work on privatization, and I always say to people, the first thing we need to look at are actually the way that our public services have been transformed. Queen's is a public university, but it operates like a private institution. And that is in no small part because of the enormous influence of new public management. If you're familiar with the literature, it has changed over the last 30 years, new public governance, etc. But the same basic principles apply around running public services like private entities. The other big shift was a more institutional financial one around corporatization. And as this symbol here shows, it's essentially ring fencing entities. So now hospitals are standalone budgetary units. Water utilities, Kingston Utilities, owned and operated by the city of Kingston, but it stands as its own entity, its own financial processes and accounting. So they don't share trucks with the rest of the city. They have to be able to know exactly what a drop of water costs them to produce. Again, there's nothing inherently bad. It's useful to know what does it cost us to produce a liter of water, right? But how that information is managed and processed, of course, is really important. But corporatization has also been ubiquitous. It has utterly transformed the way public services are operated, and institutions like Queen's now are ring-fenced entities, right? We're owned by the province of Ontario, but we don't talk about the province of Ontario budget when we have our budget discussions here. It's Queen's as this kind of budgetary business unit, and that's the language, is a business, right? And so again, utterly transformed how we think about the public sector. The third part with this benchmarking process has been the rise of proprietary benchmarking agencies that run on a for-profit basis, that own and control both processes and to some extent even the data that they collect. And so when you want to do benchmarking, it's extremely expensive, particularly if you want to hire, some of the best in quotation marks, international firms who charge, often hundreds of thousands of dollars for the privilege of being able to use their benchmarking system. But it's not full, and we don't actually get full access to the data. We know exactly what they're comparing to, etc. So these three things have combined to really create a problem around the way that we do benchmark. And the first one is an extremely narrow focus on the financial model. So, for example, do a lot of work on water, and basically it boils down to two indicators: how much non-revenue water do you have, and how many workers per connection do you have. There's over 250 criteria that they use in public benchmarking for water services, but it's amazingly narrow when policy decisions are made, and particularly with the World Bank advise countries about how good or not is your public water offering. It's expensive, as I've mentioned, and it's incredibly opaque, the process. And our next speaker is going to talk a lot about how it's being done at Queen's, but pyramid is exactly the problem that we have. So the other big thing, I think, really, is that we have let the tail wag the dog. We have let this kind of data collection replace strategic planning. I've been at Queen's for over 25 years, and I'm constantly pulling my hair about why can't we just seem to actually do old-fashioned conversations about what it is we want to accomplish as a university. How do we build the kinds of qualitative things that are important beyond the kind of number crunching that has driven so much decision? And in the end, I think it really helps to just justify commercialization. So, it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that you measure these data, you prioritize these data, and then they end up, factoring into the kinds of decisions that you make. So this is the kind of context that we find ourselves in. And I'll just close by saying and repeating, you don't necessarily need to throw the baby out the bathwater. Maybe this particular baby and this particular bathwater needs to be jettisoned. But that doesn't mean we want to jettison, this kind of thinking. As what do we want to measure? And who's going to measure that stuff? And how can we democratize that process? So I think that's our challenge, is either trying to wrest back control of this particular process, or developing something different, which allows us to say, yeah, quantitative stuff matters. Is there E. coli? What kinds of recovery rates do we have in hospitals? What are our students doing after they graduate? There's nothing wrong with collecting that information. We need to be able to do it with democratic interest. Thanks.
All right, there we go. Thank you, David. That was great. It's so helpful to have benchmarking demystified in this way. And I also really appreciate your call for empowerment, that we can do our own measuring and we can do our own agenda setting. So thanks so much. So our next speaker is Michael Savage, and thanks to Michael for inserting some jokes into your bio. Much appreciated. He's a former academic and a former consultant. With a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Toronto, he's been a course instructor at the University of Toronto and the immense postdoctoral instructor in history at the California Institute of Technology. Following his return to Canada, Michael's search for employment in higher education led him into higher education consulting, which included 2 stints with Higher Education Strategy Associates and one at the NEPS Group. So he's speaking to us from the belly of the beast. He is now the Senior Research Analyst at the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, that's OCUFA, and is thrilled to work on behalf of public education and to no longer be a consultant. So thanks so much for being here, Michael.
Great. Can everyone hear me now? All right. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Sometimes when I start talking about my past as a consultant, I feel like I'm at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. You know, my name is Michael. I have a problem. My problem is that I've been a consultant. I don't think there's any danger of relapsing, but we shall see. My presentation has a very simple goal. I'd really like to cover what consultants do on campus, which does encompass a wide range of activities. The second thing is I'd like to explore why we should be concerned about the influence of consultants. And then number three, the third aim is some additional detail on the Nous group, who will soon be a significant presence on your campus. I will say I've done some additional secondary research for this presentation, but it's primarily based on my experiences as a consultant. Now, consultants are found throughout the economy, though they typically have distinct areas of practice. We can see four on screen. There's outsourcing, information technology, auditing, and strategy. And as you can hopefully see from that graphic, these areas have overlap, but I'd actually suggest that the overlap is larger than what's on the graphic right now, and it's growing each year. So for example, the big four auditors who are on the top right of the graphic, these are Deloitte, PwC, EY, and KPMG, actually increasingly see themselves as facilitators of improved technology. And quite frankly, they're also touching on academic strategy. KPMG at this moment is doing a strategic review at the University of Guelph. However, it's the top left of the image, the Elite 3 strategy consultants, that are the most relevant model for higher education consulting. These are McKinsey, Bain, and the Boston Consulting Group. However, universities rarely use these consultants, and the reason is that they're extremely expensive. But they make extensive use of consultants who model themselves on these firms, such as Nous Group, Higher Education Strategy Associates, Academica, Strategy Corps, McPhee, the list goes on and on. Importantly, this model promises significant access to expertise, which comes at significant expense. So the more elite the firm, say it's a McKinsey, the higher the fees. Nous is reasonably elite, so you will be paying very, very high fees. Now, higher education consultants really work in several broad thematic areas. I think there's about 7, and we'll quickly go through each in turn. The first is strategic planning. They do governance reviews. They do academic planning and program reviews. They do institutional improvement or transformation projects. They conduct economic impact assessments. They're engaged heavily in internationalization. And they also create statistical collections or do bespoke research. Now, if we start with strategic plans, these are probably the most predictable and one of the more profitable sources of consulting work. They're predictable and stable because they tend to recur every 5 years. For as much as we talk about the neoliberalization of the academy, strategic plans are one spot where kind of Soviet planning comes through. These happen every 5 years. You can bank on them. Consultants bank on them. But these strategic plans can actually be done at multiple levels of the university. The most common is at the institutional level, and there's tons of work in this area. There's usually lots of consultation with faculty, staff, and students, which all doesn't necessarily make it into the final product, because all strategic plans tend to look really, really similar. I foolishly read every single one in Canada that was produced between 2017 and 2022, and I can tell you that there are almost no differences. Every single strategic plan will, shocker, say that the institution wants to be really good at teaching and really good at research. You know, wow. So it won't necessarily cause, like, academics won't necessarily take these things all that seriously, but the admin does take them very, very seriously. In fact, I never read one of these until I was a consultant. It just never occurred to me that this document would actually speak to my reality on campus. There are also faculty or department level strategic plans. There's less dollars involved in these for consultants because we're working with kind of smaller units. However, these plans are more likely to actually be collaborative and incorporate the perspectives of faculty. However, they might have a limited impact overall because really these kind of unit level strategic plans are often most about aligning yourself with the larger institutional goals. So your solutions might be partially dictated for you. Plans at this level are also not super common. You'll really just see law schools that do this, some of the largest faculties, your occasional engineering program, etc. And then finally, there's also administrative or other unit strategic plans. So things like IT strategies, international strategies, and these are increasingly common as universities get more and more admin heavy. In fact, on screen, you'll actually see an engineering strategic plan for Queen's University. It was largely created by consultants. I believe it was Hesse while I was there. I vaguely heard my strategic planning colleagues talk about Queen's engineering all the time, so I'm assuming this is their work. Consultants for these plans facilitate input, they design recommendations, they write the document. However, consultant names typically don't appear anywhere in these documents. Branding is designed to make this seem purely internal. All text says that this is from the community, even if the kind of faculty itself did not author this. Now, increasingly, boards and presidents are also contracting consultants to review governance arrangements. In fact, I have yet to hear a case of senates leading this process. And these reviews typically entail advice to promote fast decision-making. There are inevitably promises of making institutions more nimble. In fact, senior university administrators often point to the relative nimbleness of the community college sector and wish to replicate this. Of course, you may know that community colleges don't exactly have senates or faculty who determine academic directions. Now, governance reviews typically culminate in the consultants designing or proposing new governance structures, and owing to ideology and who pays the bills, consultants tend to value the input of boards and presidents. There is extremely limited engagement with faculty and senates, if at all. And I will also say that consultants have very little understanding of collegial governance. In fact, in my 4 years as a consultant, this concept was never uttered in my presence. However, I was routinely told to avoid the Senate and academics. And without exaggeration, I can say that the average consultant working in the higher education space has no idea what the Senate is or what it does. Now, on screen, you'll see some Nous work here. This is the fancy cover page of their review of Laurentian University. You will soon have Queen's University on this exact branding with that distinctive color murmuration. The recommendations here from Nous urged Laurentian to consider the possibility of moving toward a unicameral governance structure, which would have meant abolishing the Senate. Option B was, should they maintain the Senate, Nous recommended a more powerful board and a circumscribed Senate. In fact, Nous even wanted the Senate members to be subject to performance reviews conducted by a third party on behalf of the board. So it's kind of clear from Nous's work that it either does not understand collegial governance or it opposes it. In fact, their solutions really aren't collegial. They're more akin to a strict employer-employee relationship where the employees, in their view, the faculty, are charged with making the employer's desires a reality. Now, with considerable regularity, academic actors also engage consulting firms to review existing programs or to offer or potentially offer new ones. So at public universities, this can include faculty and department chairs seeking to propose new interdisciplinary programs, or simply to understand new developments elsewhere that they don't have much time to research. In my experience, it's also included the leadership of satellite campuses seeking to identify a new flagship program. And rather than talking to faculty members, they will talk to a consultant. And I will say that private universities also figure particularly strongly here. Services include kind of helping them walk through the formal government process to get their programs approved. This is known as the PCAB process, which you can see on screen. However, this is an area that really requires deep engagement with existing academic programs, and consultants would benefit from a large base of knowledge. And because the people engaging the consultants tend to be not the top leaders of the university in these projects, the pay for this work is rather low. So what this means is that you will not see a larger firm engaged in this area. High effort and low pay are simply anathema to the more elite consulting firms. Now, I say this may change, however, just because there is a firm called Hanover Research, which is a market research firm based in Arlington, Virginia, that has been recently attempting to enter this market with a really expensive subscription-based research service. Their service is going to provide access to data on student demand, market and employer preferences, and surveys, which Hanover promises will help you optimize new programs with their help. I wouldn't necessarily expect a lot of success in this area, particularly because Hanover's data is so US focused, and Canadian institutions, frankly, have not paid a lot for this type of work. I don't think it would have crossed Nous's mind to work in this area, for example. Now, Here's where I think you'll see the big players, along with everyone else. These are the projects that promise institutional improvement or transformation. And several things fall under this category, including structural reorganizations, which can range from entire universities to individual units or offices. There is comparative research or benchmarking of staffing levels. We see process or service improvements, unit or service creation. So if a university is looking to establish a new office or a new service, it is probably engaging consultants. Consultants also do strategic enrollment management, governance, and planning. They do performance reviews and audits, and they do policy development, most typically for topics like equity, diversity, and inclusion, your HR policies, your research management policies, safety abroad guidelines, etc. Collectively, these all tend to be the most profitable projects, and they vary in scope from several years and multi-millions to individual projects in the 5 figures. In fact, sorry to jump ahead here. One of the things that's on screen, actually, is York's Service Excellence Program, which was conducted by the Nous Group. This project was for 3 years and was worth a whopping $7.8 million. And it was not the only work that Nous was doing for York at this time. Enormous rates were charged, which is based off of claims that these improvements would save York many more millions. The SEP, as it was known, entailed moving all transactional services into a university service center, and it allegedly produced savings through a reduced staff load, though I will say that there were very limited initial layoffs. Rather, staff found themselves transferred between units with some regularity, and each transfer is a moment where an employee is likely to voluntarily quit. In other cases, new workers would join your unit at a higher rank than you, for example, which tends to bother staff. Staff would quit, for example. So there's all sorts of little ways that consultants and the employer doesn't necessarily have to fire you, but it can kind of make quitting a little more appealing. Now, one thing to note is that the language used at York to describe Nous's work really aligns with the communications from the Queen's University administration. I would expect that you would be getting something very similar to the SEP, though there's the potential that it may go further, as we'll discuss in a few moments, particularly when we talk about Nous's work at the University of Alberta. But I think first, perhaps let's shift to a less gloomy topic. As David pointed out, not all consulting work is inherently evil, though it can certainly be used for evil. Universities generally want to show that they benefit their wider communities, so naturally they look to consultants to craft these narratives as well. And most commonly, this is done through what's known as an economic impact statement. These products seem really, really complex, but they are deceptively simple. They simply entail running expenditures and other estimates of a university's spending through a series of multipliers to produce evidence of direct, indirect, and sometimes induced impacts. Often these simple calculations are coupled with detailing the financial benefits that accrue to individuals who have achieved a university degree versus those who have not, and then taking that difference as proof that University X contributed this many millions to the local economy. It goes further too. Some statements actually list companies founded by graduates and take all the earnings of these companies as proof of the university's economic impact. That's really common at some incredibly elite institutions. So Stanford University takes credit for Hewlett-Packard. MIT takes credit for any number of things, including if you got the Moderna vaccine, congratulations. That's MIT as well, according to their economic impact statements. Just them, nobody else contributed to that. Now, overall, these statements are pretty hand-wavy and they're very prone to exaggeration, but they can still be useful for those of us who are seeking to kind of improve university funding or to promote more hiring. The logic of these statements is rather simple. The more that a university spends, the higher its economic impact is. Ergo, higher salaries or more hiring would produce more impact. It is literally that simple. And in fact, on screen, you'll see an economic impact statement, well, the cover at least, produced by the Council of Ontario Universities. We at OCUFA use this all the time. It's great to say, look, universities contributed $96 billion to Ontario's GDP last year. There is, however, a potential drawback to this approach, as it really does posit the ultimate benefit of higher education as being ultimately financial. And in fact, ironically, I'd argue that a focus on dollars alone really leaves us with an impoverished understanding of the benefits of higher education overall. Nevertheless, these can be useful if you're, say, in the room with the Conservative government and you're trying to say, we would like some more funding, please. Now, over the past decade, we've all become aware that international students are primarily responsible for the improved financial situation seen at some universities. And though the impact isn't as large, consulting firms are benefiting from this trend as well. So consulting work in this area includes partner identification for things like degree articulation agreements and research partnerships. Consultants provide recruitment advice and international market assessments. They conduct international student services evaluations, including staff benchmarking and unit design. They provide advice on international tuition strategies. And although it's already been kind of covered under strategic plans, you'll also see international strategies for institutions and sometimes even regional strategies. On screen, you'll actually see a nice slide on tuition pricing. One of the main things that they've been doing recently is conducting tuition pricing reviews, most recently for the University of Ottawa. But their solutions were the same that they suggest to any number of universities. In fact, I was actually creating U Ottawa's Asia strategy simultaneously at another firm, and I just guessed Knaus's recommendations and wrote the strategy based on that guess. So I actually beat them to delivery of their strategy, and I got it completely right. Now, this isn't me tooting my own horn and saying that I'm a genius or anything. I just knew what they'd recommended to other universities, and I understood that their business model depends on selling the same solutions to multiple clients, for example. So I know what they've done in the past, and what they've done in the past is what they're going to be doing in the future. Now, we're at the final category of project before we'll shift gears into why we should be concerned. But the final category entails new research. And in fact, most profitably, some firms devise new research databases. So these include things like international student enrollment databases and dashboards, as well as Knaus-Cubane's Uniforum product that details administrative staffing totals and activities by function. It's this Uniforum product that really helped make Knaus particularly attractive to your administration at Queen's. Now, this type of project is highly profitable once you can sell access to the product. But developing it in the first place is very, very expensive. So one potential customer won't suffice. You will want many buying access to the same data. Perhaps less profitably, there's also targeted research conducted on behalf of university clients, but these, quite frankly, tend to be tasks that universities don't have the existing staff for, or that the existing staff simply don't want to do. I have two examples on the screen. This includes cataloging every micro-credential offered in Ontario, or logging every single supplemental fee charged by a Canadian university. I've contributed to both of those projects, and if my image is big enough on the screen, you will see my right eye slightly twitching at the memory of these. These projects are not fun, and they tend to take much more work than people might expect. And there's generally a valid reason why university staff would have said no to doing something like this. You'll generally only see smaller firms engage on these tasks, and these projects are quite likely to end up losing the money. So desperate firms are the only ones who are going to take on projects like this to bring in some dollars, but they'll often find their prospects worsening as much more effort than planned or budgeted for is being sunk into this. So smarter firms like Knaus will stay away. Now, I guess I'm echoing David here, but while not all higher education consulting endeavors are harmful, many are. And overall, I think faculty, staff, and students should be concerned about the influence of consultants. The main reason is that consultants are obsessively focused on what the client wants to hear. Clients are almost always top admins or institutional presidents, with the exception of a couple of the more minor categories we've covered. And if a client is leaning toward a potential solution, that's probably what the consultant is going to recommend. I would also say that consultants have very limited knowledge of higher education and universities. This ignorance is most pronounced around academic matters and collegial governance. To put it in perspective, I once explained the concept of tenure and the concept of the tenure clock to a VP at a consulting firm who accused me of making it up. You will know that the tenure clock is very real. There's also no understanding of precarious work, none. So at one firm, the line was that contract faculty probably have highly paid full-time work elsewhere, and that their teaching is simply a passion or a hobby. I know one or two people for whom that's true. I know many, many more for whom it's not. Consultants are also very difficult to get rid of. The most successful are experts at identifying additional work opportunities with the client and managing relationships. So doing good work certainly helps, but it might not be the most important aspect. So I couldn't actually fit all of my concerns on a single slide. So here's slide number 2 of the same thing. We'll continue. The largest firms are not only the most expensive, they also tend to be the most incurious. So there are enormous profit margins, and at Knaus, the margin is a whopping 70%, depend on repurposing existing work. New research isn't profitable. The average consultant is also remarkably inexperienced. At larger firms, many start as quote-unquote graduate hires. They're hired during their fourth year of undergrad, and these consultants are particularly prized for their malleability, their willingness to tolerate long hours, and for their ability to kind of regurgitate company cliches as if they're gospel, which I think owes to them not having accumulated significant workplace experience yet. They will become, grizzled and, a little more downcast in the future, but not right away. We also see that an anti-union animus is especially apparent among many consultants. And I think perhaps the ultimate irony is that many consultants who tend to work a minimum of 50 reported hours a week and often feel pressured to underreport their hours in order to preserve profit margin are themselves in desperate need of a union. So the NAUS consultants who will be on your campus will be working a minimum of 50-hour weeks, and many of them will be working more. Though I should say not all of NAUS's labor relations are terrible. Credit where credit is due. They do have a wonderful pay equity policy, and their paternal and maternal benefits are second to none. You will have the rare situation, which you don't tend to see in other firms or other areas, where male consultants at NAUS are often the primary caregivers for children because the benefits are so much stronger than elsewhere. However, the benefits are probably so strong because consultants are working so many hours that without these benefits, they might not be able to see their children, quite frankly. Now, maybe some good news. Consulting firms aren't all that stable. Well, okay, the very largest ones, such as McKinsey, tend to weather all storms, but the ones in our sector are somewhat vulnerable by design. So standard industry practice is to just have enough funds to cover 3 months worth of costs. Now, most consulting firms don't exactly tend to have many fixed assets. So this means that the firm that's on your campus is probably just 3 months away from insolvency at any point. And that's if you're using a healthy firm like NAUS. So smaller firms tend to have much less in reserve, and many routinely take high interest loans to cover payroll. And frankly, all consulting firms are constantly chasing new business to stay alive, and even a brief cold period can be disastrous. So layoffs are common regardless of firm size, though frankly, consultant burnout tends to account for most of the workers who end up leaving. Now, because NAUS is arriving on your campus, I think in our final section here, it makes sense to take a quick look at who they are and what they do. Well, the first thing to know about NAUS is that they are the biggest new player in Canadian higher ed consulting. In fact, I should have said, like on the slide there, university consulting, because NAUS has not yet worked in the college sector. And I don't anticipate they would because the colleges pay less than the universities. Now, NAUS is an Australian company with about 750 staff across several offices in Australia, London in the UK, and Toronto. It actually entered the Canadian market as recently as 2020, but almost right away, the Toronto office overtook the London office in importance, and it has been the major driver of expansion until very recently. The Canadian office at first was focused exclusively on higher education, exclusively on universities, that is. And the next area of expansion is healthcare. So we've got more to be concerned about. I will say that I love hearing people call it Noose Group. I think it's a very fitting name to call it Noose, but its name actually does rhyme with mouse or louse, as OCUFA has put it. And it technically means intelligence or common sense. They tell me that Australians walk around saying things like, that's so nousy, to mean that you're being so smart, though I have yet to see that in the real world. NAUS was founded by a former McKinsey consultant named Tim Orton. McKinsey is a rather notorious consulting firm with links to authoritarian governments, the opioid crisis, and even the Loblaws bread price fixing scandal. Now, to his credit, Orton quit McKinsey for a better work-life balance and to work on projects with quote-unquote positive influence. And in fact, that positive influence message actually pulled me into NAUS. I thought this was so exciting. They want me to work there, and they're telling me I'll never have to work on anything bad. And then I later learned that this is also McKinsey's push. For example, basically every consulting firm tells you that you are going to be working on projects that exclusively have positive influence. Significantly for us, in April 2021, NAUS acquired Cubane Consulting, and it's NAUS Cubane's subscription-based uniform product that details comparative staffing levels by university function, which allows leaders to theoretically make quick decisions about staffing changes. This purchase is big. and I think it will be of most concern to mid-level and lower administrative functionaries. We've certainly seen increasing casualization on the academic side of the house, but I think the heavy involvement of Cubain suggests is that we might also start to see this casualization on the administrative side. In some cases, this might strike you as comeuppance, like finally they're getting their own medicine. But I would encourage you to perhaps look for new forms of potential organizing on campus as well. It's quite likely that the mid-tier administrator that you come across is not excited about NAUS as well. So there may be allies in some unexpected places. I'll put it that way. Now, NAUS is engaged in some of the sector's most lucrative and significant projects. I've already quickly detailed the Service Excellence Program at York, but they were also contracted to provide the plan for the massive academic and administrative restructuring at the University of Alberta, which followed the province of Alberta's major funding cuts. NAUS modeled this work off of its previous work for the University of Sydney. I think this project is the worst case scenario, quite frankly, for Queen's University because it extended into the academic matters as well. It actually extended to a full reorganization where all of the faculties were reorganized into 3 separate colleges, each of which had their own dean, which is a really interesting solution for a project that was focused on reducing complexity. They actually added an additional layer of administrative complexity on the academic side, and certainly very few people at the University of Alberta speak highly of their experiences. We also see that NAUS was hired by Laurentian University in October 2021 to perform its governance and operations review. How they got the contract is kind of shrouded in controversy. They did not apply through the formal RFP process, but everybody who did was suddenly excluded. They were deemed to have conflicts of interest because in some cases they had worked for Laurentian University before or they had commented on Laurentian University for. Typically in consulting, knowing the institution that you're working with is seen as a positive, not a conflict of interest. So there's a lot of questions about how this contract came about. Perhaps there's opportunities for some FOIs and things of that nature. Now, I say we have questions because NAUS seemingly has highly lucrative government contracts. Ontario's Blue Ribbon Panel, for example, based its recommendations that universities pursue further efficiencies exclusively on conversations with NAUS. And NAUS Group's Uniforum product is geared toward these exact efficiencies. In fact, page 33 of the BRPU's report functions as an advertisement for NAUS. Its suggestions for increased automation, advancements in digital service delivery, redesigning processes to reduce complexity and duplication, and outsourcing some services echo NAUS's language. When I was reading that, I thought that it basically read exactly like an internal NAUS document. And we've just seen, just last week, that Ontario announced $15 million to support third-party reviews that will identify actions institutions can take to drive long-term cost savings and positive outcomes. This is going to be a $15 million giveaway to private consulting firms. I would expect a lot of this money is going to float to NAUS. And then finally, I'd like to argue that NAUS is a symptom of the crisis facing universities. It is not the solution to the crisis. So we know that the post-secondary sector is chronically underfunded, and NAUS profits from imposing austerity measures. We know that NAUS regularly bypasses campus faculty, students, and staff in its work. Its work for Laurentian, for example, demonstrates very little regard for collegial governance. And once NAUS arrives on campus, it seeks additional work. Its consultants are encouraged to find quote-unquote opportunities that are unfortunately out of scope to drive additional contracts. They will be around for a while. And its solutions absolutely tend to one size fits all. Its Uniforum product considers only staffing levels, not university priorities, and its consultants are encouraged to use previous solutions, most of which reflect the circumstances of individual universities in Australia. So perhaps my final message is that good times are good for consultants, but bad times can be extremely profitable, particularly if you're working to cut costs. NAUS is very well positioned to profit from the Ontario University sector's financial crisis. That's it for me. I will say that we at OCUFA are working on strategies to combat NAUS, primarily through our governance committee. And we encourage you to please reach out to us at any point about consulting operations here. We're keeping close tabs, but it always helps to hear more from you. I look forward to questions in a few minutes, but I understand we have another presentation that I'm also very much looking forward to. So thank you for your time.
Our final speaker is Norma Möllers. She's Associate Professor of Sociology here at Queens, where she teaches how science and technology shape relations of power and inequality in contemporary societies. Her research has examined the neoliberalization of science, AI, and inequality, and more recently, the coloniality of digital capitalism and transformations of state power. Her talk at this teach-in will situate Queen's recent benchmarking exercises within scholarship on governance by numbers as a means to extend market rationality to public sector organizations. Thanks so much, Norma.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, is it loud? Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay, perfect. Okay, so my background is in science and technology studies, and I thought it would be useful to situate what's going on here at Queens within the broader scholarship on quantification, and in particular critical studies of performance measures as they relate to the redistribution of material resources. This literature is actually quite deep, and interestingly, I think it started some 30 years ago as a reaction to the restructuring of the UK higher education sector. So this has been going on for a while, where assessment exercises have deeply impacted and reorganized higher education according to neoliberal principles. And David has already talked a little bit about sort of the new public management literature there. So this literature has been from the very beginning quite tightly linked to the extension of market rationality into the public sector, and it has produced a number of insights that I think are useful to contextualize what's going on here. Not sure. Oh, now good. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think three key insights that the scholarship has produced is first, performance measures appear neutral and objective description as neutral and objective description of the world, but they're really not. But the seeming objectivity really helps a great deal of lending legitimacy to them. And that may be quite an obvious point to many of us who are doing empirical research, but to many they're not. So I think it's worth repeating. Second, quantitative performance measures often create self-reinforcing feedback loops or self-fulfilling prophecies that intensify or that can intensify pre-existing relationships of power and inequality. And this appears to be true, especially in the case of performance and needs assessments that are tied to the redistribution of material resources. And the third point I think that is useful for us here in this context is that this literature has shown that techniques of governing by numbers, intentionally or not, extend market rationality into areas previously were understood as non-market and non-economic, and that this has discursive consequences that may change how we talk and how we think about political alternatives. So governing by numbers can have significant organizational, structural, and discursive effects, and I'll explain now what this might look like in the context of the performance assessment of shared services. To the first point that quantitative assessments always tell a story about power. At first glance, the suggestion to look at administrative efficiency and spending looks like a reasonable suggestion, right? You look at your expenses and then evaluate what the expenses are, which expenses are actually necessary, and then what you can do with that. However, making performance assessments always includes decisions about who and what to include in the assessment, and those decisions will shape the material consequences of performance assessment. And usually we can read those normative decisions by listening to the silences in those quantitative assessments. And in the case of NAS performance assessments of shared services, the survey that you all got, and some of you got, the big silence in the NAS survey is senior administration. Senior administration, according to the 22-23 budget report, made up 18% of the shared service budget. And that's a quite significant position. However, as you know, the NAS survey did not include any questions about senior administrators. And this exclusion tells us something about the NAS political orientation, which kind of tracks with what we already know from other places that they have consulted, and that is a preference for top-heavy administration and the centralization of decision-making power. So the point is that what gets counted counts, but those normative decisions about who and what matters and who doesn't then get hidden behind the veneer of objectivity and the sheer boringness of bureaucratic forms, right? So it's not particularly riveting topic benchmarking. But that's also an important source of the authority of numbers, right? If you do want to do something evil, or even something more reported. A second useful insight that this literature has produced is that performance assessments often create unintended consequences that end up intensifying pre-existing relations of power and inequality. And the systematic reason for these feedback loops is that performance measures are typically used for the redistribution of resources. At the same time, because performance measures rely on the removal of vast amounts of context, they are completely blind to the structural or organizational conditions that affect the performance that they measure. So, in the context of the Now survey, understaffing is a key condition that affects how well the service can perform. But all of the survey measures is satisfaction with the service, not understaffing. And all this Now service spits out in the end is a score of the lowest performing services, right here in the lower right bottom quadrant. And these lower scoring services then are at greatest risk of cuts, regardless of whether underfunding was the original reason for dissatisfaction. And the great cruelty here is that the most understaffed services may be facing the greatest risks of budget cuts because they may receive the lowest scores. So rather than improving service performance, the Now assessment may up doing the exact opposite by intensifying understaffing. And this is the feedback loop that the literature is describing. The performance assessment, intentionally or not, are often creating the realities that only prepare to describe, right? So they tend to create their own realities. And this dynamic appears to be true across a whole range of performance and needs assessments across a whole variety of institutions. At the same time, what we're seeing here again is the power of governing by numbers. What seems as a mere metric of efficiency in the context of the Queen's budget cuts is really a metric of expendability. It determines who can be laid off, right? Or may determine that. And because performance assessments at their core are scaffolded by the ideology of meritocracy, Now assessments create this cruel narrative of deserved layoffs, right? In which the lowest scoring services are cut because of underperformance, not because of understaffing. Right, as if staff were to blame for their own layoffs, right? And that's also the power of numbers that this literature describes. It removes the political and the moral nature of decision-making by refocusing our attention on bland questions of efficiency rather than the human costs of these budget cuts. Which brings me to the third insight that this literature has produced, and which is that intentionally or not, benchmarking often extends market rationality to public sector organization. And as it becomes institutionalized, it may change how we talk and think about public institutions. It turns universities into students into consumers, teachers into service providers, staff into infrastructures, and education into a commodity. And in the process, benchmarking creates this narrative that Queen's deficit is somehow the university's own fault, rather than the consequence of decades of provincial underfunding. And combined with the current provincial policy, reinforces the situation where entire universities are starting to cannibalize themselves in the name of efficiency gains. Right? In other words, it creates this massive destruction from the province's starving of higher education. The literature also shows that as governance by numbers becomes institutionalized, it can also change how we think about good governance. Good governance can mean a whole range of different things, not just efficiency, that is the topic of benchmarking, but it can mean transparency, equity, or democracy, right? But once accountability gets equated with good governance, it becomes redefined as a technical rather than a political accomplishment that is negotiated through the university's bodies of collegiate governance. And while this process of marketization has been at work for a while here and elsewhere, I think it is important not to underestimate the power of these discursive effects because they naturalize economic rationality in a way that viable political alternatives, like a truly public higher education system with no tuition fees, then appears as ridiculous or even unthinkable. So I think it's important to remain attentive to these discursive effects and not to inadvertently reproduce them as we're thinking through the implications of these budget cuts. Okay, so just to conclude, I think that critical scholarship on quantification performance measures confirms some of the suspicions that some of us have been having about Queen's benchmarking exercises, and that there are good reasons to resist performance-based measurements, especially as it relates to funding, and also keep an eye on what's happening with performance-based funding. Thank you.